Hi everyone, welcome to day 4 of PID Awareness Week. My name is Patrick Shee and I'm the manager of the Public Interest Disclosures Advice Team at the New South Wales Ombudsman's Office. This morning we have our final panel discussion, and then this afternoon we have a presentation about trauma-informed practices. To begin, I acknowledge that we're meeting on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous colleagues joining us today. We are joined today by 3 wonderful panellists. We have Candice Nielsen, Paola Rigby and Sanya Silva. The topic of today's session is Turning the Tide, Embedding a Speak-Up Culture in Practice. So throughout the week we've heard from a range of panellists about the general theme of speaking up. And in this session we're broadening our horizons somewhat, and we'll hear from our panellists about their insights and experience with embedding speak-up cultures in different contexts. Our hope is that participants might identify some similarities across different schemes where speaking up is important, and take those lessons and apply them to the PID context. As with other panel sessions, there will be time at the end for questions. Please submit them online if you're attending online, or if you're in the room today, you can ask your questions at the end to the panel. Also, please be aware that PID Awareness Week will be recorded and made available online after the event. Please let us know if you have any concerns about this. I'll now introduce our panel. So our first panel member today is Paola Rigby, who is the Director, Governance and Risk, Quality Improvement and Performance from the Audit Office of New South Wales. Paola has extensive leadership experience in governance, risk, internal audit, WHS, compliance and finance across both the New South Wales government and private sectors. She is a chartered accountant, a fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia, and is currently pursuing postgraduate studies in psychology. Paola joined the Audit Office of New South Wales in 2010, and in 2019 was appointed as the Director of Governance and Risk. She is their Chief Risk Officer, leads the governance and ethical framework and secretariat function, and provides advice to key governance committees, including the Audit and Risk Committee. Our second panel member is Candice Nielsen, Director, Strategy and Engagement at Youth Justice New South Wales. Candice is responsible for leading the strategy and engagement functional areas in the Youth Justice portfolio of the Department of Communities and Justice, including ministerial and parliamentary services, commissioning of funded services, strategic planning, data collection and analysis, and corporate reporting, among others. Youth Justice is focused on delivering better outcomes for Aboriginal children, families and communities. Guided by the priority reforms of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap and feedback from Aboriginal staff, young people and communities, Youth Justice is aiming to become an organisation that is strengths-based, culturally informed and driven by data. Candice feels privileged to be part of the values-led workforce that is driving this transformation. Candice has been part of the Youth Justice Executive Leadership Team for 8 years. Prior to joining Youth Justice, Candice worked in a variety of roles within the Department of Communities and Justice under its various names, with her first role as a psychologist working for the New South Wales Department of Corrective Services in 2003. Candice has a Bachelor of Science with honours in Psychology from the University of Sydney, a Masters of Forensic Psychology from the University of New South Wales, a husband, 3 kids and a dog named Buffy. Our third panel member is Sanya Silva, who is the Deputy Ombudsman, Investigations and Major Projects. Sanya was first appointed Acting Deputy Ombudsman, Complaints and Investigation Branch in October 2021, and was later appointed to the position of Deputy Ombudsman, Investigations and Major Projects in January 2023 to lead our newly established Investigations and Major Projects branch. Prior to this, Sanya held several senior complaint handling and investigation management roles within the office. Most recently, she was the Investigation Manager of the Investigation Team, established to lead complex and systemic investigation across the Ombudsman's public sector and community services jurisdictions. During her career at the Ombudsman's office, Sanya has dealt with over 2,000 complaints and hundreds of public interest disclosures. She has qualifications in public sector management and government investigations and a special interest in staff capability development. Please welcome our panel. To begin today's session, I'm going to invite each panel member to make some opening remarks about today's topics. So firstly, I'd like to invite Candice Nilsson to speak.
Good morning, and thank you, Patrick, for that warm introduction. Is this working? Excellent. It's always a bit weird when you sit there and hear your bio read out, but you know, I'm getting used to it. I would also like to acknowledge, of course, that we're meeting on Gadigal land today, and I'd like to pay my respects to Gadigal elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal colleagues in the room and online. Okay, so as you heard, I'm the Director of Strategy and Engagement at Youth Justice. Today, I want to talk about a reform that we're embarking on to embed a culture where our staff feel safe and supported to speak up. As you can imagine, Youth Justice works with some of the state's most vulnerable young people, those whose lives have intersected with the criminal justice system. Our purpose is to support their rehabilitation and to help them build better futures. To do that effectively, we have to ensure that our workplaces are safe, respectful, and that people are accountable for their actions. That means creating an environment where staff feel empowered to raise concerns about misconduct, unsafe practices, or cultural issues, knowing that they can do so safely and that appropriate action will be taken. When I talk about this reform work, I often use the term journey because that's how I see it. If I reflect on where we're at in that journey, we're certainly making progress, but we're a long way from the end, and perhaps we never will be. To start this journey, we had to confront the reality of where we were starting, and we used the People Matter data because it's really great for tracking progress. What our 2020 results told us was that while 30% of staff stated that they were aware of misconduct in the workplace, only 60% had reported it, which meant that 40% had not. So the reality we faced in youth justice is that despite clear policies, legislation and oversight, staff didn't always speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. This meant that incredibly harmful behaviours, such as bullying, racism and sexual harassment, were, in some cases, not even being reported, let alone being managed and addressed. This undermined trust, re-traumatised victims, and allowed harmful behaviours to persist. We knew we had to change. So we started by acknowledging the problem. In addition to the quantitative data available in the People Matter survey, we also sought out qualitative data via anonymous workplace surveys, where we probed more deeply into issues like racism and sexual harassment to understand what was happening, where it was happening, and what barriers got in the way of people speaking up. We didn't shy away from the results. We shared them openly and we used them to drive change. We clearly communicated the findings across our workplaces using workplace-specific results and tailoring nuanced messages to address the unique issues that were presenting in each workplace. We made it clear across the organisation that inappropriate behaviour will not be tolerated, that every concern raised will be taken seriously, and that every issue will be reviewed through the appropriate channels. We communicated not just the what and how of our cultural reform, but also the why. Why a speak-up culture matters to our staff, to the young people with whom we work, and to the overall achievement of our purpose. We also looked at our reporting channels and decided we needed to give staff a variety of ways to report issues and behaviours of concern, including anonymous options, and make sure they knew how to use them. To this end, we've continually educated staff about available reporting mechanisms and how to access them. We've also worked with managers to develop their capability to respond to disclosures and support both complainants and respondents. Managers are the front line of our speak up culture. They are usually the first people that staff will disclose an issue to. For that reason, how they respond, both immediately after the disclosure is made and in the weeks and months that follow, is critical to engendering trust in the system and creating the necessary positive feedback loop required to embed a speak up culture across our workforce. For that reason, we developed bespoke manager toolkits and provided targeted training to ensure managers understand their responsibilities and can model the right behaviours for staff. We also removed their discretion to manage disclosures about racism and sexual harassment locally and required that all such matters progress through our Professional Conduct Committee. Through consultations with staff and the Public Service Association, we also heard clearly that both complainants and respondents need support throughout the process, which will often take many months before coming to a resolution. So we built that into our processes and established a dedicated workplace support unit to ensure support and ongoing communication throughout. So that's what we've done so far, but as I said at the beginning, embedding a speak up culture isn't a one-off initiative. It's a sustained commitment, and it requires every leader and manager in youth justice to model ethical behaviour, even when no one's watching, create psychologically safe environments where people feel heard, respond consistently and fairly when concerns are raised, and champion the values we want our young people to see in us. So what about results? Well, we've seen an increase in reporting since we began this journey, which is a sign that trust is growing. People are speaking up because they believe they'll be heard. This is encouraging and means that we're building a culture where integrity, safety and accountability are non-negotiable, where staff feel safe to speak up, and where the young people we work with see in us the kind of role models they deserve. So thank you for the opportunity to share our journey, and thank you for the work you're doing to build safer, more ethical workplaces in your own organisations.
Thank you very much, Candice. Certainly, we've heard throughout the week about the importance of the ongoing process of developing a speak-up culture, and that it's not just something you do at the beginning and then forget about. So it's very important that that message is reinforced. I was also interested to hear about the critical role that managers play in the speak-up culture that you've established, and certainly there are some parallels with the PID scheme there. Next, I'd like to invite Paula to give her reflections on the topic today of embedding a speak-up culture in practice.
It's very loud. So thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having me here today. So in terms of a speak-up culture, I'd probably like to take a little step back and talk about why it is that some of us may not want to speak up. So looking at some of the challenges. So as social beings, we aren't inherently hardwired to be silent. There's often some deep-seated psychological reasons why we may choose to stay quiet in certain situations. These can include things like the fear of judgment. So speaking up means being vulnerable. It means talking about your thoughts, your feelings about a particular matter, and it can actually expose you to feeling or being judged, about being ridiculed, or even rejected. There's elements of stigma sometimes. So in terms of, being identified as a whistleblower or a troublemaker, or someone that's difficult. There could be shame. So particularly if you're talking about speaking up about something that you have done or a mistake. So particularly in a culture that is, say, for example, perfectionistic, where the expectation is to be performing all the time at a high level and not making mistakes. So not wanting to sort of call something out from the beginning. There's the fear of damaging valued relationships. So particularly if what you're talking about or wanting to speak up about relates to the individuals that you closely work with or even like. And so obviously there's a natural tendency to want to to fit into that group and, to make sure that you're not, bucking that trend within that group. There can be issues around a lack of confidence. So particularly when you're talking about junior or low-ranking staff. So they could doubt their own judgment and not feel confident to be able to raise concerns. There's also issues around sort of past experience. So when you've raised an issue in the past and you felt that things haven't changed, you haven't been heard, there tends to be a sense of futility. So, why would someone stick their neck out and raise concerns, particularly if there are things to lose? So again, around that, back to sort of, you could be judged or ridiculed. So if you feel that there's no change that could happen, you're less likely to speak up. There's also social learnings. So this is where it's really important, I think, in terms of the leaders, in terms of what they do and don't do. So they really do, create that culture and set that example for individuals to model or for individuals to follow as to whether they would likely to speak up or be transparent and to be, voice their concerns. And then obviously there's those cultural influences themselves. So that could be in relation to the workforce and the backgrounds that exist within any organisation. But there's not only those psychological factors, there's also, barriers, the physical, practical barriers that could prevent someone from speaking up. So that could be poor or limited reporting systems. So where systems or processes aren't clear or they don't exist, or where individuals don't know what their responsibilities or their rights are when it comes to speaking up. And another factor I think to consider about is also around conflicts. So if something that's been spoken up about actually relates to an area that you are responsible for or that you have championed, you're probably less likely or potentially less likely to want to take that further. In terms of, is that going to make me look bad? It's not just about an individual speaking up, but it's as a leader, what do you do with that information and how do you take that forward to be able to respond? So I think, before we sort of understand some of the things that we can do to ensure we foster a speak-up culture, I think it's really important to understand some of these factors as to why someone may not want to speak up and the challenges that can exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. I think it is always important to remember that those human elements of speaking up, and it's something that we've heard throughout the week as well, but it always bears keeping in mind that people are vulnerable and sometimes reluctant, and that speaking up can be alienating and might even be embarrassing. So I think it's important always to keep that in mind. So thank you very much. Next, Sonia, I'd like you to invite you up to share your insights and experience.
Thank you, Patrick. Oops. That was bound to happen because I always have to adjust them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Yes, I think so. Thank you, Patrick. I only just met Candice and Paola this morning, and in the introductions, I said to them, I had no idea what they were going to speak about, and I said to them, I'm sure our talks will come together, because it always happens in my experience, and that's exactly what has happened. So I come to this topic primarily from my experience in oversight and investigating conduct of other agencies that sometimes comes to our attention through a public interest disclosure that's made directly to the Ombudsman. But I will also reflect on my own practice as a leader and a people manager. I have dealt with scores of bona fide whistleblowers over my career, and there are two overarching themes that come up time and again. Reporting was not an easy decision for any of them. It is fair to say that the decision to report often involved a battle of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, they didn't want to report as they felt loyalty to the organisation and experienced doing so as a betrayal. Many of them feared retribution, or at least some negative consequences to their career. But in the end, an overriding sense of this just isn't right, and I want to see my organisation do the right thing, would win over both the fear of retribution and the sense that they were betraying their organisation, and they would end up reporting. The second theme involves someone's decision to report to an external organisation such as the Ombudsman, as opposed to dealing with the issue in-house. The reporters in this group actually fall into two categories. One that will go straight to the external organisation without even trying to engage with their agency. And one that comes after the internal process has, in their view, failed in some respect, or they're not satisfied with the outcome. In terms of culture, we should be most worried about the first group, those who don't even try to raise a concern internally. You might be tempted to think that going straight to an external agency is solely motivated by fear of retribution and the desire to remain anonymous. However, this is only part of the story. More often than not, this group does not engage with internal processes because, as we have already heard, they don't feel confident or safe to speak up. They don't actually know how to report, or they have no faith in the process, either because of previous experience, the prevailing narrative, or because they've tested the waters with some low-level concern and they were disappointed. They had no faith in the system after that. So they'll come to us. So I just want to unpack a little bit about what we can do as leaders to make sure, I've got it upside down, that's why it doesn't work, to counter some of those barriers that we have heard about from Paula in particular. So for someone to come, and this is actually, this diagram I have stolen from a 2015 review of the National Health Service in the UK. It was a big review into reporting. And they adapted this diagram actually from the complaint handling domain, and it's based on a vision for good complaint handling and also good reporting. And basically us as leaders have to satisfy all of those 5 things before somebody would consider reporting and go through with reporting. And all of those things have certain beliefs behind them. So even just to identify a concern, somebody has to feel confident to speak up. And that means that they feel that their organisation is supportive and that they regularly ask for their views. And I'm going to come back to that regularly ask for your views and unpack that a little bit from a practical example. And they know how to raise concern. Secondly, even after they've identified a concern, they need to feel safe to speak up in the future. They need to believe that their managers are approachable, that their managers actually know what to do from a practical sense and also from an interpersonal sense, that they will feel safe reporting to them. They also have to believe that once they do report, that their concerns are going to be looked into. And I've used the term investigated loosely because you could do a small investigation or you could do a big investigation, but it is something that will be looked at, taken seriously, and they will be kept informed. So they have to believe that that will happen before they report. And they also have to believe that there will be some sort of an outcome, that it will make a difference. And if they don't believe that it's going to make a difference, they will not speak up. So we have to do some work in that space as well. And then finally, they also need to believe that their concerns were well received. And what's important in this domain is actually reflection. And that after the whole process is concluded, there will be some sort of a debrief and consideration of how it was handled and what we have learned from this, rather than apportioning blame. And I just want to read you a quote from a whistleblower that we actually published in one of our reports, that was a result of an investigation. So this person has said to us, "I have suffered many sleepless nights of worry and still am suffering stress levels far above normal that have ongoing effect on my personal behaviours and family life outside of work. I feel used, abused, let down, tarnished within the agency. In effect, I feel abandoned." And then, and this is what I wanted to share, they said, "There has been no debrief on the matter. There is in effect a silence surrounding the matter." And it seemed like this was the hardest part for this person, that they were not able to talk about the matter. So for us to be able to foster a speak-up culture, we have to be listening up. So it is about developing a listen-up culture before people will actually speak up. And how a South African whistleblower, Wendy Addison, said a few things about, a few years back, the hard thing about listening up is mustering the courage and selflessness to act on the information that you're receiving. And I'll leave you with that thought. But before I conclude, because I did promise to give you a practical example about regularly asking for people's views. One thing that I did in my team, and it was a new team back in those days, they were not coming to me with concerns at that time, probably because they didn't know who I was and they were a little bit reluctant. So we did an exercise that allowed them to self-reflect about the future and to write anonymously on pieces of paper what they were hoping for our team and what they were fearing. And then we collected those, and it gave us a really rich picture about what people were worried about and also what they were hoping would happen, and that allowed us to unpack some things that we could build into our processes. But what it did do is it normalised talking about fears and possible problems in the team, which lays a good foundation to maybe later, when there is a more serious problem, people feel more comfortable in coming and talking to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Two things that really stood out to me from your comments were about the critical role that ongoing engagement plays in engaging with people who report, but also that comment you made about speaking up being a two-way thing, that it also involves listening up. And I think it's important to remember that as well. So thank you very much, everyone. We're going to move now to some questions that I have for the panel. The first question is, what are some practical steps that organisations can take to embed a speak-up practice, culture in practice, sorry. Paola, I might go to you first, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Patrick, is that working? Yep, good. So I think, again, when we talk about, or when we think back about what some of those barriers are and how you can address those barriers about speaking up. So one of the things I think is about acknowledging the courage that an individual has taken to be able to speak up and to actually thank them for speaking up and to raising their concerns. I think only that way that they then can feel appreciated and feel valued for their voice, their concerns, their thoughts. I think there's also, as we said, two-way communication. So it's about having or listening with empathy and also listening without judgment. So obviously the empathy side of things is really about, pausing, taking the time to really listen, to be inquisitive, and, again, without that sort of bias. So particularly if it involves multiple issues, or if it involves or is said within a performance management issue or a disgruntled employee or other factors that, you know, as a leader or as someone receiving a report, that they're actually listening to the actual information that's being said. I also think you need to have a fit-for-purpose reporting system. So you really need to think about the organisation that you work for. In terms of, say for example, you've got a smaller organisation in one office compared to a larger organisation across multiple locations, or with involving individuals that do vastly different activities in a day. So they might not be, for example, you know, don't have a laptop. And so making sure that the reporting systems that you implement consider all those factors, as well as the workforce itself. So, you know, think about I guess the background of the individuals within a particular within your workforce or within your team. So there could be backgrounds where, you know, it isn't common to be able to speak up or easily speak up. There could be age factors as well. So, you know, I think sort of studies have shown that younger generation are more likely to understand their rights, and therefore likely to speak up than maybe an older generation, but obviously that's not always the case. Yeah, and the other thing I think is about training your leaders. So again, back to, you know, listening with empathy, with judgment. It's ensuring that the leaders understand how to receive information, and, you know, also recognising when someone is making a public interest disclosure. So often when someone does raise a concern, and if it does involve wrongdoing, they're not necessarily saying, well, I'd like to make a public interest disclosure. So you need to really be able to understand what that is, to be able to recognise it and respond appropriately.
Thanks, Paula. You spoke there about, I guess, leaders being attuned to listening in, and Sonia, you spoke about that as well. Do you have any insights to share about the practical steps of embedding a speak-up culture in practice that might even touch on that listening aspect?
Technology is intimidating sometimes. I totally agree with you, Paula, about little things, about thanking people when they have raised issues with you. And as we have all touched on the topic of people see things but they don't report. So just being aware, if you're not hearing things, if people are not coming to you, that's actually not necessarily a good thing. And it means that you need to be proactive and do something about it, just so that you can increase the trust in people. And that will largely depend on the context and how big your team is, what kind of position you're in. The little example that I just used could be a starting point, or if it's a bigger organisation, it could be things like some drop-in session. And the reason why I'm emphasising that is because it is so important to normalise the conversation, so that when things do go wrong, people feel confident to come and approach you and talk about things that are unpleasant, so that you don't find them out once it's too late, or you get it from a source that you'd rather not get it from. So while it's unpleasant to hear something negative, it's actually understanding that that's a good thing because we need the information.
Candice, you were agreeing with a lot of what Sonia had to say there. And you've had a lot of experience now in embedding a speak-up culture in practice. What are some of your practical steps that you might suggest that agencies think about?
If I can just kind of carry on that theme for a little bit, I think in terms of making sure that managers have the right capability to respond when complaints or issues are raised is one factor. The other factor from a youth justice perspective is making sure that there are those multiple reporting channels, and sometimes the direct line manager may not be the right person to receive that report. And I think about some of the factors you talked about, Paola, in terms of people being intimidated to come forward. You know, if I think about some of the disclosures we've had in our workplaces around sexual harassment, for example, if your line manager is a man and you're a woman wanting to disclose, you may not feel comfortable making that disclosure. So what we've really focused on in YJ is offering a whole range of different avenues to make disclosures, even outside of youth justice. So we're in a broader department, obviously, in communities and justice. There's an anti-racism unit that's been set up where people can make anonymous disclosures around racism experiences in the workplace. So I think that's a really practical thing that we can do, is just making sure there's lots of channels. But if people don't know that the channels exist, then they're useless. So it's really about making sure there's awareness of those channels. I think the other thing that's really important is to tell the story of your organisation openly and honestly. So when we look at our People Matter data in youth justice, it's really concerning. Some of the results that we see, I've talked about racism, I'll talk about racism. 25% of our Aboriginal staff report experiencing racism in the workplace. As an executive team, that's incredibly confronting. But the people who are out there experiencing racism every day know that that's going on. So it would be crazy for us to try and pretend that's not going on. And so we've chosen to speak really openly about it, and we've really seen that generate a lot more trust in the system and a lot more people prepared to come forward and talk about those challenges. Something else we've done practically that I touched on in my opening remarks was we've taken away the discretion of managers to deal with issues like racism locally. So in the past, you might have somebody come forward and make a disclosure, and then they would be encouraged to go and mediate with the person who was the perpetrator of that racism against them, which is so re-traumatising for the victim and didn't get any outcome. And I think sometimes managers don't necessarily know, and they think, oh, we'll manage this locally, but it doesn't manage the issue. It makes the issue worse. And so we've just said that all of those matters need to go through a formal process now. So that, and again, that is encouraging more and more people to come forward and talk up about those issues.
Thank you very much. We'll move now to the second question for the panel. And the question is, can strategies from other contexts, and as an example, work health and safety, be applied to or complement the PID scheme? Sanya, I might go to you first. Certainly we've heard about how other contexts have, I guess, a speak up element to them. What are some strategies from those other contexts that might apply to PID?
Yeah, so the little round diagram that I had up on the PowerPoint, that was adapted from a big complaint handling research with people outside of an organisation who want to raise concerns. However, it was very adaptable to internal complaints and to disclosures within an organisation, because the issues are largely the same. The fears are similar, except that they are even amplified when you're inside an organisation because of all of those things that we've heard. The added fears when you're working with your peers or you're working with friends that you otherwise like, but then you have observed them doing something else. So complaint handling is one domain that is very useful for us in the public interest disclosure space. And the other one is the safety that you have already touched on, Patrick. I think you mentioned work health and safety, but that adaptation was in the health sector, because obviously things will go wrong in a high volume area that deals with things that are just, things sometimes go wrong, and there are safety issues, and it is so important to speak up in those environments. So we've got a lot to learn from them, because unfortunately they have learned from some bad experiences. Others of us who don't have the equivalent safety concerns can learn a lot from those domains.
Thanks, Anya. Candice, you've spoken extensively about your context and the lessons that you've applied to developing a speak-up culture. Do you see any sort of strategies that might apply to other areas, and especially PID?
Absolutely. You mentioned work health and safety in the opening address, and I think There are a lot of parallels between work health and safety and encouraging a speak up culture, particularly in the context of PIDs. Not having a speak up culture, having a workplace where misconduct goes unchecked, unreported, is a safety issue. So it's a psychological safety risk, but there's also physical safety risks around that as well. So I think that idea of if you have a good safety culture, that requires leadership, it requires training, it requires reporting systems, and it requires consistent follow through. The same is applied with creating a speak up culture where people are going to make reports through formal systems like the PID system. I think the mechanisms that are put in place around work health and safety also apply in this context. So things like having regular audits, nod to my audit colleague here, incident reviews, so looking at when people have made reports, actually deep diving into what has happened in that instance, reviewing that incident, looking at how you can improve in the future, and having regular feedback loops so that people are advised of outcomes and know what's happened when they've made a report. So I think that, as I said, strong parallels between the work health and safety system and that idea of having a speak up culture.
Thanks, Candice. Paola, we heard in your biography that you have experience with WHS, but you have experience in other contexts as well. Do you have any insights to share for us about strategies to apply potentially to PID?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So definitely in terms of the WHS space, where fostering a psychologically safe environment is so important, obviously for well-being and health and safety, but it does definitely is broader than that in terms of speaking up and feeling safe to speak up. But also, I think in that WHS space, when we talk about speaking up about taboo subjects like mental health, so setting those examples in that space about talking about some of these very difficult subjects that for some it's not a natural thing to talk about, particularly in the workplace where it can be perceived as, for example, if I have, anxiety or some issues about what I'm working on, could I be perceived as being something less than or performing less than? So really, speaking up about some of these taboo subjects in areas like WHS and in other areas, I think, bodes well for encouraging a speak up culture. I think the other area too is certainly my space in the risk management space. So New South Wales Treasury released their risk management toolkit back in May, and there's actually a whole chapter in there that talks about creating a positive risk culture. So it talks about core behaviours around consistently demonstrating that risk management is valued, that you need to have open communication and consultation and proactively reporting around risks. And so when we talk about risk management, we're talking about, one, identifying potential risks and raising those risks, and it generally does come from those that are on the floor. So it's not necessarily coming from leaders, it can come from different avenues. And also when we talk about a positive risk culture, we're talking about having an environment where we look at these things as an opportunity to learn and to improve. So it's not something that should be punitive, that should be, again, going back to, you've made a mistake. We're really talking about being that sort of open and transparent to detect things early and say that, we can actually make a correction here, so to prevent something from what could be quite small turning into something a lot larger or impacting a lot of people. So I think definitely there's some synergies there. And back in 2018, so the Audit Office did do a review on positive risk culture, and it spoke about, ensuring communication. It also spoke about having a look at what your own culture is. And it doesn't necessarily mean having an audit or necessarily embarking on this massive sort of consultation, but there's information that's already out there that you can look at, like the People Matter employment surveys. So there's a lot of questions in there that talks about or asks employees around, are they comfortable to raise concerns? You know, would they feel, are they confident that when concerns are raised that something will happen? So there's a fair bit of information in that I think any organisation can have a look at, any agency can have a look at, to sort of give a hint or an inkling, are we doing okay in this space, or is there more that we can do?
Thank you very much, Paola. Certainly throughout the week we've heard about the importance of hearing from staff and the role that plays in identifying issues within a workplace, so it is very critical. The third question that I have for the panel is, what can managers, disclosure officers and other staff do to ensure a healthy speak-up culture is sustained? And Candice, I wanted to start with you on this question because you spoke about the role that managers have played in your speak-up scheme. So I'm certainly very interested to hear your thoughts on this question.
Thanks, Patrick. I think first of all, it's really important that managers are role models of the behaviours that we want to see in the workplace. So managers have to demonstrate integrity, managers have to be fair, they have to be open. And I think, you know, we hear a lot about the leadership shadow, and it's so true that staff will pay so much more attention to what leaders do than what they say. And people are watching leaders all the time and looking to see how they respond. So spending time with managers, helping managers understand that really critical role they play is so important. I think it's also really important that when we respond to matters, we're consistent in our response and we're also fair in our response, because again, oftentimes, although disclosures are meant to be anonymous, there's a kind of shroud of secrecy, people do talk. And so, you know, people in the workplaces will often be aware, not always in the PID context, but in other disclosures, people are looking and they're watching, and they will see if there's one course of action taken in relation to one particular concern and then a different course taken or for a different group of staff, and that very quickly erodes trust in the system. So it's really important to think about consistency and fairness. The other thing I would say, because we talked about sustaining the culture, is just really that commitment to staying the course. And when we started this journey in youth justice, our executive team had a conversation right at the beginning. What are we going to do when this gets hard, and when it gets harder than it currently is? Because as soon as you start putting the mechanisms in place, disclosures, hopefully, do start to flow. And so it can feel sometimes like things are getting worse before they're getting better. And that can attract attention as well. So it's really important that everybody who's responsible for leading the change is committed to staying the course and going the distance, and that you've already had conversations about what you're going to do when it does get tough.
Thanks, Candice. I mean, those comments are similar to what Sanya had to say about it's a better thing to get reports than it is to not get reports. So, but it does nevertheless get difficult, and questions can be asked about why so many reports are coming in. Paola, I wanted to go to you next. Can you please share your thoughts on how to sustain a healthy speak-up culture?
So I think it requires a multifaceted and consistent approach. So again, back to the previous question, where there's other areas that require a speak-up culture and the benefits of that. So whether that be in the WHS, risk management, and other areas, we need to be consistent across all areas, so that when we talk about within the PID scheme, it's actually a reflection of other conversations and other areas and how we address some of these other areas. Because if, for example, you're not addressing WHS concerns very well, despite the fact that you might be addressing the PID concerns, but if an individual's experience is, well, I've spoken up about something in the WHS space, or I've spoken up about, I had an idea actually about how to improve something and it really wasn't taken very seriously, or I didn't feel heard. So when something does happen in terms of that wrongdoing space, I'm less likely to speak up. So I think there needs to be consistency across multiple areas. I think the other thing too, just in terms of having something that's sustained, having those one-on-one conversations is just part of your regular, I guess, activities. So it then becomes so that someone does want to raise a concern. They already have a rapport with someone to speak to, so it will naturally come up in conversations. But I think also with those one-on-one conversations that as a leader, for example, that you may not be very close to what's happening on the ground, and those one-on-one conversations can actually be a bit of an eye-opener. And so that if you continue to have these sort of one-on-one conversations, you can, through those conversations, kind of track what's happening within that culture that may have implications for speaking up. So those sort of continued conversations, those continued forums, and those avenues to allow people to feel comfortable to speak up, I think, will ensure that that's sustained.
Thanks very much, Paola. Sanya, what about your thoughts on sustaining a speak-up culture?
I wanted to pick up on something that Paola said earlier about having a learning frame rather than a blame culture. Obviously, when there's serious wrongdoing, there's got to be consequences. But what we can learn from the experience and what we can change and how we can improve things and how that's communicated is absolutely crucial to building the confidence and in the system, and also knowing that raising issues makes a difference. And I also just wanted to re-emphasise the last slice of that pie about the debrief and about not being silent about difficult things, but actually acknowledging that this has been difficult for everyone. And this is what we've done within the confines of confidentiality, but we do tend to get a little bit too paranoid sometimes about what we can and can't share. So try and think about that a little bit more flexibly and actually have a debrief and talk to people about the experience. That also will build confidence for the future. And one last thing I wanted to mention is a few years back now, we did, with my old team, we did this little exercise where we tried to tease out some of the underlying cultural drivers in the team, something I learned from a workshop. And what came out of that exercise is that we actually had a pretty good culture in that team, which was fantastic. But what became obvious to us is that we couldn't take that for granted. And that we just couldn't assume that that was going to stay indefinitely. So we needed to look at, well, what can we do to actually preserve that culture into the future? So think about that as well.
Great, thank you very much. So that concludes the questions that I had for the panel. I now want to open it up to anyone who might be online or in the venue today. Does anyone have any questions for us?
Thank you. Thank you to the panel, that was really good. Todd Hobwood from Wollongong Council. I just want to ask a question about the anonymous reporting options. We're looking at expanding some of those. Have you faced organisational resistance in terms of potential for the misuse of that at the lower level? Everyone accepts the value of it above board, but we're just looking at some issues in terms of some resistance from executive and unions about the potential for it to be misused for low-level grievances and potshots.
It's an interesting question. We haven't, but if we had, my response to that would be people will always find ways to make anonymous complaints. So they'll go through the PID scheme, or they'll write a letter to their minister, or, there's a whole range of ways that people can raise anonymous complaints. And I think, why wouldn't you legitimise that and make it a formal way for people to raise concerns? Because of the value that has for your staff as well, to recognise that even if somebody's not prepared to put their name to a complaint, and so often there's reasons why people aren't prepared to do that, that it will still be listened to and acted on and taken seriously. So that would be my response to that.
Any other insights from the panel?
So we don't have direct experience, I don't think, with Anonymous, but I'm aware that some agencies have gone down that route. People will always try to look for loopholes in anything. I think that's unavoidable. So you just have to look for the gold, I guess, and deal with the other things as you normally would.
Paula?
Yeah, so I think as the Audit Office, as an integrity agency, so we are or do receive PIDs about, from other agencies, so individuals from other agencies, and often they can come through as anonymous. And I think there is still worth and there's still validity, I think, in that avenue. So I think if you were to sort of shut that down, there is that potential that you do actually shut down then people actually speaking up. So I think it does potentially create a barrier. But I guess acknowledging though that when someone does, raise a concern anonymously, there's no avenue to be able to ask more questions and to find out more. So sometimes, depending on what was included in that matter or that complaint, it may not be very clear as to what the actual issue is or how to address it. So I think when you have your reporting system and for example, if you do allow for that anonymous reporting, that letting individuals know that there are limitations with what an agency can do should they choose to report it anonymously, so that they might think, to think otherwise, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I think we might have a question online.
We do. A question for the panel. Does the panel have any tips for speaking up or building a speak up culture in an agency that lacks a strong culture of openness and transparency, and where the tone at the top doesn't actively encourage speaking up?
Is there anyone who'd like to share some insights there? So it's about how to develop a speak up culture where it might not be necessarily supported at the top.
So sometimes I think it can be just in those general conversations. I think so. It's not necessarily having to say to someone, look, come to me if you have a concern, or, go to this, or in reminding individuals to making sure that they are identifying all the bad stuff. It could also be about identifying all the good stuff as well. So I think it's really encouraging within your teams, within those meetings, those one-on-ones, to really, I think, foster that approach about people just trying to be, or allowing them to be open, I think, so that should something come up within that sort of more serious nature in that wrongdoing space, that I think an individual may likely to voice their concerns more likely. So I think it's just part of that natural conversation and just making it normal.
If I can add to that, what my advice would be is it would depend on your sphere of influence, I suppose, and be realistic about what you can do. If you can't change the whole organisation, don't try. But you're likely to have some control over your immediate circle, depending on your position in the organisation. And focus on that, focus on what you can change. Little pockets of good practice can make a big difference for the whole organisation, and you can get some momentum over time.
Great answers. The only thing I think I can add is to acknowledge how hard that is when you don't have top-down support for a significant organisational change, like wanting to create a speak up culture. It can feel almost impossible to affect change, but I think my two fellow panellists have given some great options for that local sphere of influence and what you can do in that space. I also think it's really important to, I guess, go back to our fundamental values in the public service and think about the integrity that we bring to the roles, the trust that's put in us as public servants. And so that's why it's important that even if you don't have that top-down support, you have to, as a public servant, be thinking about your role as a steward of the system and be thinking about what you can do in your own sphere of influence. And I think, you know, just to focus on that and to continue to be true to those values that each of us kind of have to uphold as public servants.
Great answers. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the panel discussion today. We've had some really insightful discussion, and I know that a lot of people will have benefited from hearing about all of your experience. So thank you very much. Can I please ask everyone in the room to thank the panel for joining us today and for their insights? And that concludes the session now. And please remember to join us later for Kate Peterson's session about trauma-informed practice. Thank you very much.